I'd like to welcome you to this series of devotional studies. I've entitled this series, Righteousness from the Heart. In it, we will be examining the first few verses of Matthew chapter 5, the beginning of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, verses that we commonly refer to as the Beatitudes. I anticipate a rich and rewarding study because of the topic, and I hope that you will be benefited from it. Before we look at the Beatitudes themselves, let's talk just for a moment about the phrase that serves as the title for our devotional series, Righteousness from the Heart. What does it mean to be righteous? Or let me ask that a different way. What does it mean to be right with God? Look at what the Apostle John has to say in 1 John chapter 3 and verse number 7. He says, "Little children, let no one deceive you. Whoever practices righteousness is righteous, as he is righteous." And so, on the basis of this verse, we can say that righteousness is doing what is right. And we associate being right with God with things like reading the Bible, attending worship, praying, giving, visiting the sick, and that list can go on and on. But I think it is also important that we understand that these activities alone do not make a person righteous. Let me illustrate. A person can read the Bible and yet be an atheist. A person can be present at a worship service without participating in worship, or a person can offer to God what the Bible calls vain worship. In Matthew chapter 15, beginning at verse number 7, listen to what Jesus says to some in his day. He said, "You hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you when he said, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men.'" And later on in this Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew chapter 6, in the opening verses of that chapter, Jesus will warn against praying to be heard or giving to be seen. And the Apostle Paul warned the church at Corinth about their coming together in worship to observe the Lord's Supper. Listen to what he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse number 20. He said, "When you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper that you eat." Now, all of these activities are right in and of themselves. They were observing the Lord's Supper. They were giving, or they were praying, or they were reading the Bible. They were engaged in worship. But there was something amiss. There was something missing. And so while the right action is important, and I think we could even go so far as to say the right action is necessary, it is essential, something else is needed. And that something else is this: that right action must be joined together with the right attitude of heart. Or to say it another way, to be right with God, we must do the right things. And we must do those right things with the right attitude of heart. And so the title of this series of studies, Righteousness from the Heart, emphasizing not only the right action, but also the right attitude, and that these two are combined together. Now let's also take a moment as we begin our study to look at the context of the Beatitudes. One important theme in the Sermon on the Mount is the kingdom. And I want you to look with me in the 5th chapter as Jesus opens this Sermon on the Mount. And these first few verses are the Beatitudes. Look at the first Beatitude in verse number 3. "Blessed are the poor in spirit." Now note the phrase, "For theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And you go down to the last of the Beatitudes, verse number 10. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. And here's that phrase again. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Jesus opens the Sermon on the Mount with the Beatitudes. And at the beginning and ending of the Beatitudes, he has that phrase, theirs is the kingdom. Those who exhibit these Beatitudes, or these attitudes of heart, to these people belong the kingdom. And then skip over to the end of the Sermon on the Mount. It's in chapter 7 of Matthew. And notice verse 21. And he says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter into the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. And so at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, at the ending of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus emphasizes the kingdom, and he emphasizes what is important or essential to be a part of that kingdom. And so Jesus is going to tie together the right action and the right attitude when it comes to being a part of the kingdom. I heard one teaching on this once make this point, and I think he made a good point in doing so, that the Sermon on the Mount gives us the necessary qualities necessary for one to enter into the kingdom. And it also gives us the qualities that are necessary to live as a citizen in the kingdom. And so in the Sermon on the Mount, if you're going to be a part of the kingdom, and if you're going to live effectively as a citizen in the kingdom, here are the qualities of heart. Here are the attitudes of heart that are necessary in order to be a part of the kingdom. In a sense, we could say that the Sermon on the Mount draws a word picture of the citizen of the kingdom. If you want to know what a citizen of the Lord's kingdom looks like, then read the Sermon on the Mount, and you'll get an idea. Through the years, we have taught, and rightly so, that to be right with God, you must be a member of his kingdom. And the Bible uses the term kingdom and church interchangeably. And so we are right to say that a person must be a member of the Lord's church to be right with God. But I think it's also important to emphasize, it's not just enough to be a member of the church. It's not just enough to be a part of the kingdom. But we must be a certain type of member. We must be a certain type of citizen in the kingdom of God. And so just like our discussion of the word righteousness, being a member of the church or being a member of the kingdom must be from the heart. And these attitudes, taught in the Beatitudes, must be a part of our character. And if we fail to develop these attitudes, if we fail to allow these to be reflected in the life that we live, according to Jesus, we can't be a part of his kingdom. It's that important. It's also important to remember that Jesus directs these words toward his disciples. If you're going to be a disciple of Jesus, here's what he requires. This is what's needed to enter into and to live as a part of his kingdom. And what was true then is also true now. We must live by the principles of this sermon if we're to be his disciples, if we're to be a part of his kingdom, if we're to be members of his church. I don't think we can overemphasize the importance of these opening verses in the Sermon on the Mount. Verses from Jesus, teaching from Jesus that helps us to live righteousness from the heart. And I hope you'll join me each week for this study, a study that I believe will help each of us to be faithful disciples of Jesus, that will help us to develop and to live by the principles that are set forth in the Beatitudes, principles that will produce righteousness from the heart. Until our next study, may God richly bless your life.